Before we start today's story, please let us know your location in the comment section and don't forget to like and subscribe. A few nights ago, I uncovered a truth so shattering that it made me question everything I thought I knew about my life. I was working late, testing a new security system I had recently installed at home, an advanced piece of technology with crystal-clear video and audio capabilities. I had been adjusting its settings for days, syncing it to my phone and fine-tuning the features. That night, I finally had the chance to test out the live feed. The system was so sophisticated that it could pick up even the faintest sounds with incredible clarity, including quiet conversations in the background. I opened the app, eager to see how it worked in real time. At first, all I could hear were the usual ambient sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards. But then I caught a voice, Kathy's, coming from the living room. She was on the phone, her tone calm, almost casual, but there was something about it that made me pause. I turned up the volume and leaned closer to my phone. "She doesn't suspect a thing," Kathy said, her voice laced with amusement. My stomach churned. Was she talking about me? I tried not to jump to conclusions, but the way she sounded, so relaxed, so confident, made my heart race. The voice on the other end of the call was muffled, but Kathy's laughter cut through, sharp and cold. No, he's clueless," she continued. "Albert? Please. He's too wrapped up in his little gadgets to notice what's right in front of him." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, my mind racing. Was this a joke? I desperately wanted to believe I had misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation. But then her tone shifted. No more laughter, just a cold, deliberate edge. "Okay, hold on, let me call you back," she said quickly. A second later, I heard her dialing another number. My heart pounded as I realized she wasn't finished. I adjusted the feed, barely able to breathe as I listened intently. "Hi, thanks for calling me back," Kathy said, her voice now sharp and professional. "Yes, I've made my decision. We'll move forward with the plan." Plan? My mind was racing, scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing. The silence on the other end of the line only made her next words more chilling. "Once we pin this on him," she said slowly, deliberately, "I'll take the kids, the house, and everything else. He won't see it coming." I gripped the phone so tightly my hand ached. Her voice was so steady, so calculated. It felt like she was making a business deal, not plotting the destruction of our entire life. "No, it won't be an issue," she continued almost casually. "Roger has already lined everything up. All we need is for Albert to stay predictable, and trust me, he always does." Roger. That name struck me like a dagger. Roger, her coworker, the one I always thought was harmless, the one I had dismissed as just a friend. But now, hearing Roger's name in this context made my blood run cold. Kathy let out a short, almost amused laugh, as though the conversation was nothing more than a joke. "He'll never see it coming," she repeated, her voice dripping with confidence. I sat there, paralyzed, in my office, unable to process what I had just heard. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a cold, calculated plan to destroy me. Looking back now, the signs were everywhere, but I was either too blind or too trusting to recognize them. It wasn't just one thing. It was a series of small, unsettling moments that I had dismissed as ordinary bumps in the road of a long marriage. But now, in hindsight, they felt like breadcrumbs leading to a betrayal that had been brewing for months. Kathy had started spending long stretches of time in the backyard, pacing with her phone pressed to her ear. She always claimed she was catching up with old friends, but the calls felt secretive. Her laughter would float through the air, light and carefree, but sometimes I'd catch fragments of her words. Once, I distinctly heard her say, "You're right, he really is oblivious." When I asked her about it later, she brushed it off with a smile, calling it just girl talk. I didn't press the issue. Now I wonder if every one of those conversations was part of something much bigger, something she had been plotting right under my nose. The arguments began not long after. They were small at first, almost silly things like where the car keys were or why the groceries weren't put away properly. But they quickly escalated, her tone growing sharper than I'd ever heard before. I remember one time, after one of her long calls, she stormed into the house, furious that I hadn't taken the trash out yet. It was 10 minutes past the usual time. Just 10 minutes, and it turned into a full-blown shouting match, with her calling me lazy and unreliable. At the time, I chalked it up to stress, but now I wonder, was she looking for reasons to paint me as the bad guy? It wasn't just her tone. It was the way she looked at me during those arguments. Her eyes weren't filled with anger or frustration. They were calculating, like she was cataloging every word I said, every reaction I had. There was something almost rehearsed about her outbursts, as if she was trying to provoke me, hoping I would say or do something she could later use against me. The emotional distance between us didn't feel accidental. It felt intentional, strategic. I would catch her staring at me sometimes, a faint smirk playing on her lips, as though she knew something I didn't. Those moments would pass quickly, and she'd go back to her normal self, laughing with the kids or scrolling through her phone like nothing had changed. But something had changed. I could feel it, even if I couldn't identify exactly what it was. And then there were the little things that made no sense. Changing the password on her phone for security reasons, insisting on handling all the bills herself when we'd always done it together, or canceling plans at the last minute because she was too tired. At the time, I saw these as quirks or signs that she needed some space. Now, they feel like pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was supposed to solve. In hindsight, everything is so clear. Every argument, every hushed phone call, every cold glance. It wasn't just a rough patch. It was her carefully building a case against me, brick by brick, while I remained oblivious to the walls closing in around me. The moment everything came crashing down wasn't because of a forgotten phone or a suspicious text. It was far messier than that. It happened in the middle of one of those explosive arguments that had become our new normal. This time, it was about the thermostat. She stormed into the kitchen, shouting that I'd left it set too high, and I snapped back, asking why every little thing seemed to set her off lately. That's when it happened. Maybe if you listened for once, Roger, we wouldn't have to go through this, she snapped, her face flushed with anger. Time froze. The word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. Roger. Not Albert, not even Babe or Hun, but Roger. Her eyes widened for a split second before narrowing into a glare, daring me to call her out. My stomach churned, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Did you just call me Roger? I asked, my words slow and deliberate. She scoffed, rolling her eyes as she turned away. Don't be ridiculous, Ben, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. You're overthinking again. You always do this. You're so paranoid. But the slip-up had already cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. I stared at her, searching for any sign of guilt, of remorse. But all I saw was anger. Cold, calculated anger. As if somehow this was my fault. Who the hell is Roger? I demanded, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. She crossed her arms, glaring at me like I was the irrational one. You're being insane, she snapped. Roger is nobody. Just stop it. Her deflection only made the pit in my stomach grow. My mind raced, connecting dots I didn't even know existed until that moment. Roger, the name she had just let slip, wasn't nobody. He was somebody. He was the coworker she always laughed a little too hard with at office parties. The one she insisted was just a friend when I'd asked about him months ago. I stepped closer, my voice cold now. Don't lie to me, Kathy. Is Roger the reason for all of this? The phone calls, the fights, the secrets? Her face twisted into a mask of indifference, a mocking smile curling on her lips. You're unbelievable, she said, shaking her head as if I were the irrational fool. I don't have to stand here and listen to this. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, my heart pounding, her words echoing in my mind. Your paranoid Roger is nobody. But her slip had already exposed everything. Roger wasn't nobody. He was the answer to all the questions I hadn't dared to ask before. And now, there was no turning back. The need for answers clawed at me like a sickness I couldn't shake. I couldn't tolerate her evasion, her lies, or her venomous attempts to paint me as crazy. So, one evening, when Kathy grabbed her keys and muttered something about meeting a friend, I made a decision. I would follow her. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my own keys and tailed her car at a safe distance. My palms were slick with sweat as I maneuvered through the streets, keeping my headlights dimmed and staying far enough behind. I watched her drive through town, taking turns that led us out of our usual areas and into the wealthier part of the city. The houses grew larger, the driveways longer, the gates taller. She finally slowed near a sprawling estate, surrounded by high hedges and a black iron gate. My chest tightened as I watched her pull into the driveway. A few moments later, the gate slid open, and she disappeared inside. I killed the engine and parked down the street, just out of sight. My heart raced so loudly that it drowned out my thoughts. What was she doing here? Who did she know in a place like this? I crept closer on foot, careful to stay hidden in the shadows of the manicured trees lining the street. As I reached the edge of the property, I spotted them, Kathy and Roger, through the slats of the gate. They stood near the entrance, bathed in the warm glow of the porch light. Kathy was laughing, her arm casually draped over his shoulder, her body language so familiar, so intimate, it made my stomach twist. Roger leaned in, his hand resting possessively on her waist, saying something that made her laugh even harder. It wasn't the laugh she shared with me. It was lighter, more carefree, as if she were a completely different person when she was with him. I strained to hear them, crouching behind a low hedge just outside the gate. Their voices were quiet, but I caught fragments of their conversation, words that sent fresh waves of anger and confusion crashing over me. "When this is over," Kathy said, her voice trailing off into a giggle. Roger's response was quieter, but his tone unmistakably serious. "We need to get it done faster. I don't want this dragging out." My mind raced. What were they talking about? What needed to be done? And why was she laughing about it? I stayed hidden, watching them like an intruder spying on a life that no longer felt like mine. The life I thought I had with her was unraveling right before me, piece by piece. I wanted to burst through the gate and demand answers, to confront her with everything I knew, or thought I knew. But I stayed frozen, torn between fury and desperation. I was afraid of what else I might uncover if I stepped closer. After a few minutes, they went inside, the door closing behind them. I stood there in the dark, my fists clenched, my mind spinning. Whatever this was, it was bigger than I'd imagined, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might find next. Dinner started like any other. The sound of utensils clinking against plates and the kids chattering about their day filled the room. I sat there, barely touching my food, my heart pounding as I rehearsed the words in my mind. The weight of what I'd seen at Roger's estate, the things I'd overheard, was too much to bear alone. I needed to confront her, and I needed her to face the truth. Not just in front of me, but in front of the kids too. Maybe, if she saw their faces, she'd feel some shred of shame, some flicker of guilt. "Kathy," I said, my voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. She glanced up from her plate, her fork midair. The kids looked at me, puzzled by my tone. "What?" she asked, her expression neutral, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "Weariness, maybe." "I know about Roger," I said, my words landing like a thunderclap in the room. The kids froze, their eyes darting between us, confusion etched on their faces. Kathy's hand paused, her fork hovering for a moment before she slowly set it down. "I'm sorry." "What?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm, her face a mask of feigned innocence. "Don't do that," I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Don't play dumb. I know what's been going on. The calls, the meetings, the lies. I know everything." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, her expression shifting to something colder, more calculating. And then, to my shock, she smirked. "You're pathetic, Ben," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think anyone's going to believe you over me? You're delusional." The kids looked at her, their faces filled with confusion and fear. "Mom," our daughter whispered, her voice trembling. But Kathy didn't even glance at her. Her eyes were fixed on me, daring me to push further. "This isn't just about me believing it, Kathy," I shot back. "It's about the truth, about what you've been doing behind my back while pretending everything's fine." She laughed, actually laughed, as if I had told her the most ridiculous joke she'd ever heard. "The truth?" she scoffed. "Oh, please. You've been paranoid for months, always snooping, always suspicious. Maybe if you spent more time being a decent husband and less time playing detective, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere." Her words hit me like a slap, but what stung even more was the look in her eyes, absolute contempt, as if I was beneath her. "I saw you with him, Kathy," I said, my voice shaking now, the fury and betrayal overwhelming me. "At his house, laughing, talking about getting it done faster. What the hell were you planning? Tell me." She just rolled her eyes, her smirk never wavering. "You don't know what you're talking about." She dismissed me, as if I was the one being ridiculous. "And even if you did, who's going to believe you? Me, the loving wife and mother, or you, the unstable lunatic who's been stalking his own wife?" I glanced at the kids. Their wide, terrified eyes were fixed on both of us. My daughter looked on the verge of tears, while my son sat frozen, gripping his fork like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the moment. "That's enough," I shouted, slamming my fist on the table. The plates rattled, and the kids flinched, but Kathy didn't even blink. She leaned forward, her smirk fading into something darker, more menacing. "You're out of your depth, Ben," she said quietly, her voice dripping with malice. "Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. Trust me." It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. And in that moment, I realized just how far gone she was and how much danger I was truly in. That night, I sat alone in my study, staring at the family photo on my desk. We were all smiles, me, Kathy, the kids, a picture-perfect family, but the truth had shattered that illusion. The woman I thought I knew, the life we built together, it was all a lie. Her words from dinner echoed in my mind. "You're pathetic, Ben." The smirk, the venom, the threat. It was all I needed to know that reasoning with her was pointless. She wasn't going to stop, and if she was willing to destroy me, I wasn't going to sit back and make it easy for her. I opened my laptop, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I logged into our bank accounts, staring at the balances, savings, checking, joint investments. It was all there, ripe for the taking. I thought about how she'd laugh if I let her walk away with everything, how she'd probably celebrate with Roger once she'd wiped me out. My jaw tightened. Not a chance. With a few clicks, I initiated the transfers, draining every last cent into a new account I'd opened in my name weeks earlier, when my suspicions first started to surface. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess myself. By the time I was done, the accounts were empty, the credit cards canceled, and the auto payments for her gym, her subscriptions, and her flashy new car, all turned off. I left just enough in the kids' college fund. It wasn't their fault any of this was happening. But for Kathy? Nothing. She'd made it clear I was her target, and now I was making it clear I wasn't going down without a fight. Before I walked out, I grabbed a piece of paper and scrawled a single sentence across it. No long explanations, no pleas for her to reconsider. Just 7 words that said everything I needed to say. You can't steal what's already gone. I placed the note on the kitchen counter, right next to the coffee machine she used every morning, and then I left the house. No bags packed, no dramatic farewell. Just the clothes on my back and the certainty that I was finally in control. As I drove away, I felt a strange sense of calm for the first time in months. I wasn't reacting to her games anymore. I was taking action. And while I had no idea what she'd do when she found out, one thing was certain. The playing field had shifted, and this time, it was on my terms. The next day, I braced myself for the storm I knew was coming. Kathy was many things: vindictive, cunning, relentless. But above all, she was predictable when cornered. Still, even knowing her nature, I wasn't prepared for just how far she would go. Around midday, she stormed into my office. I was in the middle of reviewing some reports when the door flew open, slamming against the wall. Heads popped out from nearby cubicles, my colleagues craning their necks to see what was happening. And there she was, Kathy, dressed to perfection, but with fury blazing in her eyes. "Ben!" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the hallway. My boss, Mr. Brown, had just walked by and froze mid-step, turning to look at the commotion. My blood ran cold, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Kathy," I said evenly, setting my papers down. "This isn't the time or place." "Oh, it's exactly the place," she spat, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Everyone here deserves to know the kind of man you really are." Whispers started rippling through the office as my coworkers exchanged uneasy glances. A few looked at me silently, asking if they should intervene, but I shook my head. I wasn't giving her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. "Kathy, let's go outside," I said, standing up with a measured tone, but she wasn't having it. "Why? So you can try to intimidate me like you always do?" she barked, then, with a dramatic sweep of her arm, turned to address the room. "Did you all know he has violent tendencies? Oh, he's charming here at work, I'm sure, but at home, he's a completely different person." The air in the office grew tense. Mr. Brown stepped forward, brow furrowed, while my colleagues exchanged glances filled with discomfort and doubt. Some whispered among themselves, unsure of how to react. I kept my face neutral, though my fists clenched at my sides. "That's enough, Kathy," I said firmly. "You know that isn't true." "Oh, don't you dare," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "You've been gaslighting me for years, making me feel crazy while you undermine everything I do. And now, after everything I've done for you, you drain the accounts and leave me with nothing." There it was. This wasn't about the supposed violence. This was her retaliation for taking away her access to my hard-earned money. "Kathy," I said, locking eyes with her, my voice low but steady, "you're embarrassing yourself. If you don't leave now, I'll have no choice but to call security." Her face twisted into a snarl, but I saw the flicker of doubt behind her eyes. She wanted me to snap, to prove her wild accusations true in front of everyone. But I didn't take the bait. Mr. Brown stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "I suggest you leave. This is a professional workplace, and we don't tolerate this kind of behavior." Her jaw clenched as she glanced between me and Mr. Brown. For a moment, I thought she might escalate things further, but then she let out a bitter laugh and shook her head. "You think you've won, Ben?" she said, her voice cold. "This is far from over." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. The room stayed silent for a beat, then the murmur of whispers returned. Mr. Brown gave me a long, assessing look before nodding and walking away. I exhaled slowly, letting the adrenaline drain from my body. My coworkers avoided eye contact, pretending to be engrossed in their work, but I could feel their unease lingering in the air. Kathy thought she could destroy me with lies and theatrics, but what she didn't realize was that I wasn't the same man she had manipulated for years. I had the truth and the evidence to protect myself, and I wasn't backing down. Kathy had always been a master of appearances. Her charm was magnetic, her smile disarming, and she wielded them like weapons. So when the fallout from our confrontation at the office wasn't enough to humiliate me into submission, she pivoted. She organized a fundraiser, a grand event to raise awareness for a local charity she had barely supported before. But it was clear to anyone paying attention that the real purpose was to restore her image and make me look like the villain in the eyes of the community. This time, I was 2 steps ahead. Days before the event, I had already planned my move. The recording of her phone call, the one where she laid out her cold, calculated plan to frame me, was my trump card. I knew timing was everything, so I waited, biding my time as she sent out invitations, curated the guest list, and meticulously prepared her speech. The night of the fundraiser arrived, and I watched from a distance as people poured into the venue. It was a dazzling display of opulence, twinkling lights, elegant table settings, and a sea of well-dressed attendees. Kathy stood at the center of it all, beaming as she greeted her guests. Her mask was firmly in place, and for a moment, I felt a pang of disbelief that she could carry on like this after everything. When the room quieted for her speech, I knew it was time. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the send button. The email was ready, addressed to the entire guest list of the fundraiser, with a recording of Kathy's call to her lawyer attached, complete with a transcript of her damning words. "Once I pin this on him, I'll take the kids, the house, and everything else. He'll never see it coming." I pressed send from where I stood, just out of view of the event, and watched as the ripple effect began. Guest phones vibrated and pinged in unison, the sound cutting through the polite applause as Kathy launched into her speech. At first, it was subtle, people pulling out their phones, glancing down, brows furrowing as they read. Then came the whispers. They spread like wildfire, growing louder and louder until the hum of murmurs filled the room. Kathy faltered mid-sentence, her eyes darting around the room. She noticed the shift, the stolen glances, the disapproving stares, the shocked expressions. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice losing its practiced poise. No one answered her. Instead, the whispers turned into audible snippets. "Did you hear what she said? Can you believe this? What kind of person does that?" Her composure cracked. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice now shrill as she tried to regain control. But it was too late. The carefully crafted persona she'd spent years perfecting was crumbling before her eyes. Someone in the crowd stepped forward, a local businesswoman who had always supported Kathy's charity events. She raised her phone, her expression one of cold disdain. "Care to explain this, Kathy?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room. Kathy's face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her confidence slipping with every word. "Oh, really?" the woman replied, shaking her phone. "Because this recording makes it pretty clear who you are, and it's not the person you've been pretending to be." The room erupted into chaos. The whispers turned into open confrontations as guests questioned Kathy's integrity and motives. Her voice was drowned out by the noise, her protests falling on deaf ears. She looked around, desperate for an ally, but found none. I turned and walked away, the sounds of her unraveling echoing behind me. For the first time in months, I felt like I had regained control. She had underestimated me, and now she was paying the price for her lies and deceit. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the next day, Kathy's name was on everyone's lips, but not in the way she had hoped. The recording spread like wildfire, forwarded and shared among the town's most influential figures. I made sure of it. Every person who mattered, her charity circles, her social clubs, even her parents, received a copy of the recording. No one could claim ignorance of who Kathy really was anymore. Roger, her so-called ally, was the first to jump ship. I heard through the grapevine that he had gone radio silent, no longer returning her calls or texts. The golden boy, a co-worker who had been so eager to push things along, suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. I wasn't surprised. For someone like Roger, self-preservation was everything, and aligning himself with a sinking ship like Kathy would only drag him down. Kathy, on the other hand, didn't go quietly. She tried to salvage what little she could of her reputation, calling friends and allies, spinning story after story about how the recording was taken out of context or completely fabricated. But the evidence was undeniable, and the town wasn't buying her lies anymore. Her friends, many of whom had been swept up in her charm for years, stopped answering her calls. Her name became toxic, whispered about at brunches and cocktail parties, spoken with sideways glances. Even her parents, who had always doted on her, refused to defend her this time. From what I heard, they were furious, not just because of the scandal, but because they too had bought into the image she had so carefully constructed. The humiliation hit her hardest when she tried to show up at one of her regular haunts, a boutique cafe where she used to hold court with her circle of admirers. The once friendly staff avoided eye contact, and the usual smiles from acquaintances turned into awkward nods or outright snubs. Kathy, for all her bravado, was visibly shaken, her carefully curated world crumbling around her. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background, watching as her lies unraveled. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching someone you once loved self-destruct. But there was a grim sense of justice in knowing that the truth was out, and her web of manipulation could no longer ensnare anyone else. By the end of the week, Kathy's calls to the kids' school to complain about me were ignored, and her attempts to rally legal support for a case against me were laughed out of the room. Every piece of her plan had fallen apart, leaving her exposed, alone, and exactly where she had tried to leave me, with nothing. When the custody battle began, Kathy waltzed into the courtroom as though stepping onto a stage. She had her crocodile tears ready, dressed in muted colors that screamed victim, and spun her tale with the flair of someone who had rehearsed every word. She painted me as an unfit husband, a controlling monster who had drained her accounts and abandoned her. For a moment, I wondered if the judge might fall for her act. Kathy was a master manipulator, but when it was my turn, I didn't need theatrics. I had the truth on my side. My lawyer laid out the facts. The recording of her phone call plotting to frame me, the financial records showing how she had siphoned money for personal luxuries while neglecting our household expenses, and her blatant lies about my supposed violent tendencies. We even brought in testimony from several of her former friends and colleagues who had distanced themselves once they learned the truth. One by one, their statements painted a picture of a woman who was calculating, manipulative, and utterly untrustworthy. As the evidence mounted, Kathy's confident facade started to crack. When the recording was played in court, her face went ashen. The judge leaned forward, listening intently as her own damning words filled the room. Once I pin this on him, I'll take the kids, the house, and everything else. He'll never see it coming. When the audio stopped, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Kathy scrambled to recover, insisting the recording was out of context and that she'd only said those things out of frustration, but it was too late. Her desperation was clear, and her arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. The judge, a no-nonsense man with little patience for deceit, didn't mince words. "Mrs. Parker," he said sharply, "your behavior as documented here demonstrates a clear pattern of manipulation and bad faith. This court cannot, in good conscience, place the children in your care." Kathy gasped, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "Your Honor, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm their mother." The judge interrupted her, his tone unwavering. "As their mother, your actions should reflect their best interests, not your own selfish agenda. Custody is awarded to Mr. Parker. Furthermore, given the financial evidence presented, your request for alimony is denied." I sat there, the weight of months of turmoil lifting as the judge's gavel came down. Kathy's face twisted with disbelief and rage. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for words to lash out, but none came. She was out of moves, and she knew it. As we left the courtroom, she caught up to me in the hallway. Her voice was low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Ben," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. I turned to her, calm and resolute. "No, Kathy, I said. The only thing I regret is not seeing through you sooner. She didn't respond. She simply stood there, watching as I walked away. The kids were waiting for me just outside the doors. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The fight was over, and I had won. Not out of spite, but because it was the right thing for me and for our children. Even after losing in court, Kathy wasn't done. She was like a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. I should have known she'd try something drastic, but even I couldn't predict how low she would go. A few weeks after the custody ruling, a police officer showed up at my door. My stomach sank as he handed me a notice. Kathy had filed a report claiming I had assaulted her. According to her statement, I had violently attacked her just days after the court decision. She had even provided photos of bruises on her arms and face as evidence. At first, I felt a surge of panic. Her lies had worked on so many people in the past. What if this time they stuck? But as I sat with my lawyer reviewing the report and the so-called evidence, my panic turned to anger. This wasn't just another lie. This was a calculated attempt to ruin my life completely. Kathy had made one crucial mistake, though. She had underestimated how much credibility she had already lost. Between the court recordings, her failed fundraiser, and the countless people who now saw her for who she really was, her word carried little weight anymore. When the investigation began, it unraveled faster than she could have ever imagined. The bruises Kathy showed in the photos didn't match her story. Medical professionals reviewing the images quickly identified signs of makeup rather than real injuries. The police also requested timestamps and metadata for the photos, but Kathy conveniently couldn't provide them. Then, the final blow came. Surveillance footage from a local cafe on the day of the alleged incident showed Kathy laughing and chatting with friends, completely uninjured. The footage was leaked online and quickly went viral, with the public's reaction being brutal. She became the subject of mockery and scorn, her name trending across social media alongside memes and hashtags calling her out for her lies. When the police dismissed the case due to a lack of evidence, they didn't stop there. Kathy was warned that filing a false report was a criminal offense. Although no charges were filed, the damage to her already crumbling reputation was irreversible. Word spread quickly that even her remaining allies, those who had stuck by her out of loyalty or ignorance, had finally turned their backs. Her name became synonymous with deceit, a punchline in every conversation in town. As for me, I refused to let her final scheme control me. I had my kids, my peace of mind, and the truth on my side. Kathy's desperate games only solidified what I already knew. I was free from her manipulation, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions. Now, months later, after the dust has settled, I can't help but reflect on everything that's happened. This has been without a doubt the hardest year of my life. I lost the family I thought I had, the woman I thought I knew, and the future I believed we were building together. But through all the lies, the betrayals, and the schemes, I found something I didn't realize I had lost, myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's the importance of trusting your instincts. Those nagging doubts, those little signs that something isn't right, they're there for a reason. For months, I ignored mine, convincing myself that the cracks in our marriage were just stress or routine disagreements. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Looking back, I wish I had listened sooner, but I'm grateful I listened when I did. Standing your ground was another lesson that came hard, but proved to be worth everything. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when I thought about letting her lies and manipulation win just to escape the constant battles. But every time I looked at my kids, I knew I couldn't. They deserved the truth. They deserved a future free from the chaos she brought into our lives, and so did I. Now, I'm focused on moving forward. The kids and I are settling into a new routine, one that's stable and calm, so different from the turmoil we once endured. We laugh more now, talk openly, and I can see the weight lifting from their shoulders. They're starting to feel safe again, and that alone makes every fight, every sleepless night, and every confrontation worth it. If there's one thing I hope anyone reading this takes away, it's this. Even in the darkest times, there is a way forward. It won't be easy. It will hurt, and you'll question yourself 1,000 times. But the truth has a way of cutting through the lies and lighting the path ahead, even when everything feels lost. I hope my story serves as a warning and a reminder. Trust your gut, stand firm, and never let someone else define your worth or your future. The pain doesn't last forever, but the lessons you learn will. Now, as I look ahead, I'm not afraid anymore. The worst is behind me, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like the best is yet to come. Dear listeners, Please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.